Hello, my fellow creatives. I'm Hayley from Creative Photo Folk, and this week I'm going to show you how to take your animal portraits and remove distractions to make them worthy of wall art. Now, you may be asking why you would want to do this, and the reason is, first of all, it will help you crop out distractions. So this image is a pretty good image in itself. I actually really like it, but there are some pretty distracting spots of light in the background. So first of all, this takes care of that problem. But not only that, I've seen many a wall art in this style with a black background featuring an animal, and in fact, I know of quite a few photographers who specialize in this technique and have had exhibitions, etc. So it is worth learning if you are into wildlife photography. So for this technique, you'll obviously need some close, well-focused photos of animals. If you don't have any, why not head to your nearest zoo with your longest lens and a high shutter speed and use something like back button focus so you can really lock focus on the animal's eyes. If you've spent any time in my world, you'll know that I absolutely advocate for back button focus. It's the way to make sure that you nail focus 90% of the time or more, and it really, really helps in a zoo situation. Or maybe it's time to do a portrait shoot with a family pet. I primarily see this technique used with horses, so if you have any lying around, they will make a great subject too. So before we get started, I'll just tell you a little about this image. So I photographed this in Japan up in the mountains where the snow monkeys live. This was a popular tourist spot, so even though they were wild, they were fed every day, so they come down into their little pool for the tourists to photograph. So it is kind of a not entirely ethical situation, but you don't actually know that until you get there. So this snow monkey was photographed with quite a long lens. I wasn't particularly close to it, but it was looking at the camera, which was very kind of it. And it was obviously a rainy day, as well as the fact that they like to go swimming. Now, I do note that in the final image, the monkey has lost quite a bit of fur around the edges here, and that's something I could spend more time on selecting. I won't be showing you that today. That does require some pretty advanced work, and that's the kind of stuff I teach inside my Photoshop course, Exposing Illusions. But I don't think it's necessarily a problem either. I think we've got enough fur there still to make it look realistic. The only time that would bother you is if you had seen the original. So even though I've done this edit already, we're going to start again from a blank slate. And the first thing we need to do is make a selection of our monkey. And currently the best way to do that in Photoshop is using the object selection tool. So that is the fourth one down on your toolbar here, and it's the top one of the choices that pop up. And all we need to do at this stage is run our cursor across the monkey and press it once, and then we'll just take a look at how Photoshop does it selecting it. It does take a little while. Let me add a layer mask and take a look. That's not terrible. What I'm going to do for comparison's sake is just make a copy of that layer, delete the layer mask on this copy. So I did that with Control or Command J to make the copy, and then I right click to the layer mask and just hit delete. But making sure this new layer is selected, I'm now going to go to select subject just so we can see which one does a better job of making a selection. For this technique, it does not have to be perfect because it is somewhat forgiving. So let's see. That one has done a better job of the fur, but this one, as you can see, neither of them are perfect. This one's just a little rougher around this edge here. So I think I'm going to go with the object selection method, which was this one here, the fourth one down and then clicking across. So I will delete the other select subject layer. And I'm just a bit bothered by this one bit of hair here, so I will just paint that away by loading my brush tool. So B is the shortcut for that. Making sure I have black selected here in my swatches, and then on making sure this layer mask is selected, I will just paint that away. The other thing I'm going to do is just paint, whoops, now this time I need white to paint back, and I'm just going to paint back this little rock it was sitting on. So now for our black background, we will add a solid color adjustment layer. So to add an adjustment layer, we go down here to our little half pie, and we would go to solid color, the very one at the top. Making sure that black is selected, so you can just drag around in here to choose your color, and black is always bottom right, and then I'll hit OK. And I will drag this layer underneath our monkey. So as you can see, there's still a little bit of work to do to get to this point. So the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit of an advanced technique. So with our monkey layer selected, I'm going to double click just in the blank area of that layer, and that's going to bring up our layer styles panel. So in here, what I'm going to do is add a inner glow. Now, right now, the inner glow is making the monkey glow, which we do not want, even though that's what it says on the box. So we actually want to add a inner shadow, which there is an inner shadow, but I just like the way the inner glow works better. So to do that, we will click on this little yellow color picker here. Well, it's yellow at the moment. Yours may not be. And then I'm going to drag that down into the blacks, which is your bottom right, and hit OK. Now we probably won't see that at the moment. Nope, because it's set to the blend mode screen. And what we need to do is change that to multiply. Now we can bring in a little bit of darkness to the edges of the monkey by playing around with the sliders. It can take a little bit of experimentation to get this right, as you probably just noticed, but it does make a difference, as you can see. So we will run with that. I'll hit OK. So the next thing we want to do is darken the monkey down, because right now it's far too bright to be in this situation. It doesn't look realistic. So the first thing I will do is add a curves adjustment. And we can do that down here with our adjustment layer icon, which is like a little half white black pie. Click on that and we will add a curves. And here I'm just going to very generally drag the middle down to add a bit more contrast to the monkey. So that's not too bad. And then just to show you a different way and also to make a few more adjustments, I will now add a different type of adjustment layer, being a levels. So levels and curves are quite similar. They have the same purpose, but they just behave a little bit differently. So in this case, I'm just going to drag in my blacks a tiny bit. So blacks are on the left. So I think the monkey's looking pretty good here, but this bright edging is still not ideal, as you can see from the original. Now, before we move on, I'm just going to clip these two adjustment layers so they are only affecting the monkey layer and not anything below it, which at the moment we've only got black, and you can't do a lot of things to black, but we may do some stuff later that it might affect. So what we want is just these two layers affecting only the monkey layer and nothing else. So to do that, we have to clip these layers to the monkey layer. And the way to do that is by holding down Alt or Option, and you'll see that the hand switches to a little box and arrow. And now I can just click between the two layers, and it means these layers are now only affecting the monkey and not anything below it. So now to darken up these edges, the first thing I'll do is add another curves adjustment layer, and again pull down the middle. And really I'm not looking at the monkey anymore, I'm just looking at the monkey's edges, because what I'm going to do now is press Control or Command I. And if you're paying attention to the layers panel, you'll see that the layer mask for this layer is now swapping between white and black. We currently want it black because we don't want it affecting the monkey. What we do want to do is paint it around the monkey's edges just to darken those up so they look realistic. So to paint now on our layer mask, we need to load our brush tool with B, and then making sure that our swatch is actually set on white because we want to paint this effect in. So you can do that by hitting the little arrow. And now making sure your brush is quite soft, which you can do up here. This little tool here. I want a hardness at 0. And now we can just start to paint around the monkey's edges to darken some of these spots that are currently a bit too bright. That's pretty good. But this bit of white is still really bothering me. So again, I'm going to add a second curves adjustment layer exactly like we did last time. But this time, I'm going to pull down the highlights. So your highlights is your top right. And what that does is pulls down the very brightest part of your image. So we'll get that maybe to about there. And again, press Control or Command I to invert our layer mask so it's not affecting anything. With white loaded, we'll start to selectively brush that in wherever the monkey would not be being hit by the light. So you really need to think about this. So in this case, these little hands are the furthest out. So Do monkeys have hands? Are the furthest out, as would be probably this area of the leg. So everything else we can kind of darken down a little bit. Now I'm still a little bit bothered by these bright spots on the edges. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a blank layer. So we do that with this little plus button here. And this time I'm going to just paint black. So I will make sure that black is loaded. My brush is loaded with B. I'm going to bring down the opacity. So opacity is here and I can just drag across the word opacity to bring that down to about 50% just so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to start to paint around the edges that are a bit too bright for my taste. I think that is looking good. And then we will just bring that opacity down a little more to bring back some more detail. There we go. And so I'm just going to compare this to the original that I did. So they are still quite different in terms of where the light is hitting. But the other thing I'm really noticing is that the monkey's face is very red in this version we're working on. So to fix that, there's several ways, but the easiest one is, the reason this happens is because when you darken a subject up, it actually makes them more saturated. So we need to fix that using some of the layers that we've worked with. So first of all, the very first curves layer we added. To fix this problem, what we can do is change the blend mode. So currently it's on normal. If I click that, I can actually set it to luminosity. And what that means is that that layer is only affecting the lightness values and not anything else. So not the colors. So let me do that again with the levels layer. We'll change that from normal to luminosity. And I'll just show you in the history what the before and after looks like. So that is before. The face is quite red. And after, we've definitely taken the sting out of it. So in essence, they do look now a little bit more similar, but the light is still very different. And that's really going to be down to personal interpretation of how you think the light would be hitting. In this example, it looks more like the light is sort of hitting a little bit from the right, whereas this one more from the front. So that is totally just down to how you choose to paint light in. I still think this is perfectly acceptable though. So one other thing I did is cropped it a bit differently. So because we now have a black background, you can crop it however you like. So I used the crop tool with C and I made it 8:10. So I did that up here. You can choose your ratios that you want to crop to. And 8:10 is the best kind of for Instagram. And so now we have that monkey has a little bit more breathing room. And the final thing we can do just to give a little bit of life to the background is add a texture over top. Now, I'm going to use a texture that I have pre-prepared. So this is one I took in Malaysia of just a wall. They have such interesting walls in that country, which is bizarre. And so I'm just going to, with my V tool, so my move tool loaded, V is the shortcut, I'll just grab it, pull it up onto that document, pull it down, drop it in. So it's just giving me a little warning saying that the documents are different qualities. That's fine. I'm going to say yes. Drag that into the corners and then I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Rotate 90 degrees. So now it fits, but you'll see that the lighter portion of the texture is at the bottom. So I'm just going to Edit, Transform, and Flip Vertical so that that bit is at the top. I'll drag it into the corners, and now because it's not quite fitting, I'm just going to press Control or Command T to bring up my transform tool and drag out those edges so that it fits. Doesn't matter if it's bigger. I'll just hit the plus. Now, I don't want this affecting the monkey, so I'm actually just going to go down to the layer mask of the monkey and hit Control or Command on that layer mask, which reloads it. And now I can, making sure that my texture layer is loaded, I can hit my layer mask button. So now the texture is only affecting the monkey, which is what we do not want. We want it swapped, so it's only affecting the background. So to do that, I'll make sure my layer mask is loaded. Press Control or Command I to swap it around. And this currently looks terrible. So what we can do is actually go through our blend modes to see if anything works, but it's sort of hard to find ones that blend with black. You'll see a couple, but most of them just won't. So we might just leave it at normal and really just drag down the opacity of it to the point where you can't see this black edge around the monkey. So it will be very subtle, maybe about there. So that's at 9%. And the other thing you could actually do is keep that a little bit higher so you can see the texture. But we could add a curves adjustment layer and then clip that curves with Alt or Option as we've learned how to do. And then just pull down the darkness of it until it matches the monkey. So that actually looks pretty good. So that's before and after. So it's just popping in a little bit of extra detail. But that is that. So that is, I think I do still prefer my original. I really spent a little bit more time around the eyes, I think. But I think both of those are perfectly acceptable. So do you want to take a look at some other examples? If you do, stay tuned. So this guy was a cow I photographed at a farm animal rescue. And so this is what it originally looked like. Again, I quite like that background. There is a little bit of a distracting tree or something there. But obviously I cut out the cow, I added a black background, I darkened the cow up. Now in this case I used an exposure layer, and we haven't talked about exposure yet, but I might show you how exposure works. So exposure is just an adjustment layer. We add it like any other type, but in here we can drag down the exposure obviously, but we can also play with the kind of matteness of our blacks, and the gamma sort of works more. Oh, look, I'm pretending I know how this works, but I don't. But I like what it does. It's a really, really subtle way of affecting your darks and highlights. So that is before and after. So that's another option, as well as curves and levels that you might like to use. In this case, I have done whatever that does to it, and I've only masked it in over. I've masked it away a little bit from the cow's face. So then using a curves, I just darken the edges as we've already done. I used a hue saturation this time to take out some of the sting, so you'll see how red the cow was before. I used another exposure layer really to darken down this edge here. So that's before and after. Took even more saturation out, this time over the entire cow. And then finally, I made it a little bit less red. So I like that one. I think it's cute. This guy here, so the original looked like this. There's obviously a lot of distractions. It was photographed in a zoo. And the first thing I did was, in this case, I actually kept the ground in because the deer needed to be sitting on something. So when I made my layer mask, I made one that was just the deer and then one that was just its feet. And you might see that there was lots of little like bits of poo or pellets. I'm not really sure. Don't want to know, to be honest. And so I had to actually clone those out, which I won't go into today, but you can see, let me see, before and after. So then as usual, I used the levels and the curves to darken them up, change that blend mode to luminosity, took out some of the saturation, added a curves. So this just really darkens up the edges, yet again, including the floor. And then finally added another exposure layer just to darken everything down even more. And so that was that result. I really love deer. They're probably my favorite animals, so I'm quite fond of this one. Now this one I really like, so let me show you the final. So it looked like this. So I first made a selection of my subject, and then I use that inner glow to get rid of those really bright edges. Next I added back the log, and I did that in 2 layers, and I honestly couldn't tell you why I did that. Now this guy I did a little bit differently. I painted his edges first, and then I did my big sweeping changes. So I just painted black around the edges at an opacity of 24. Then I used the curves painted around the edges. So that was just brought down in the middle. And then I used another where I just painted a bit more black on the layer and made that a bit heavier. So that was at 76%. Then I did my big sweeping changes, so curves overall, which brought down a little bit of the highlights. I added another curves overall, which I actually, in this case, made the blacks less matte. That's something we haven't talked about yet. So if I bring down this curves, my blacks are very black, and I thought they were too black. So I set a little point here to say to the curve, I want this to stay the same. But then I put a second curve, and I just pulled that up, and you can see how it makes the blacks less severe. And that's a really, really good little trick to know for this technique as well, in case those blacks are too black for you. And then finally, I added a hue saturation where, again, I just took out some of the saturation that was added by playing around with darkening this subject. So that is how that one ended up. So before. So this was a bear photographed in Canada at a zoo, and that is the after. So it's a pretty cool technique, right? Now, I've seen many a portrait in this style hanging in Airbnbs and hotel rooms. Plus, it's a wonderful way to capture pets, whether your own or as a gift for a friend. So have a go at this one and see what you think. If you love getting creative with your camera, then subscribe to my channel for fun future projects. Happy creating. See you next time.